Climate change is threatening the world's food supply. That's according to a UN panel. And it says the way land is used has to change. So, how will governments deal with this warning? And can the planet still be saved? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohamed Jamjoom. We've seen report after report warning us of the dangers of climate change, and that is happening right now. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put the minds of more than 100 scientists together, and what they're saying is alarming. Not only are rising temperatures threatening the planet, but so are our eating habits. The way food is farmed is drastically degrading the Earth's land, and scientists predict that's making global warming worse and will lead to food shortages. As Katia Lopez-Hodoyan reports, one solution may be that we have to change our diets.
In many parts of the world, land is being overworked and misused, and it's increasingly being swallowed up by the effects of global warming. Heat waves and droughts are turning once fertile lands into deserts. That's the latest warning from scientists.
I think the takeaway message is that the way we use land matters because it impacts the climate, and that we also should use land as a solution.
The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says global warming and poor land use practices are having devastating effects. Entire communities have lost their crops, livestock, land, and livelihood.
Small-scale farmers who depend on rain to grow their crops are left guessing about whether the rains are going to come, whether there'll be enough. So it's really an urgent message to governments.
The report calls on governments to promote small-scale farming and to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It also urges consumers to do their part by reducing meat consumption.
The way we produce food and what we eat contributes to the loss of natural ecosystems and declining biodiversity.
It's estimated that 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption, about 1.3 billion tons, goes to waste every year. The UN panel says limiting the amount of waste would free land for reforestation and crop growth. A warning to stop pushing land to its breaking point, and a call for governments to pay attention. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's bring in our guests. Simon Lewis is Professor of Global Change Science at University College London, and he joins us from London. Patrick Holden is CEO of Sustainable Food Trust, and he joins us by Skype from Lampeter, Wales. And Jan Kowalzig is Senior Climate Policy Advisor at Oxfam Germany, and he joins us from Berlin. Welcome to all of our guests. Jan, let me start with you. Time is running out. There is a finite amount of land and an ever-growing population. Just how dire is the situation we are all facing now?
This is what the report of the UN IPCC is all about. So it is a dire warning saying we must take urgent action to reduce the pressure on climate and on land, both at the same time. So climate change is already worsening poverty in the world. It's increasing the problems we have with hunger. It's impacting food systems. It's decreasing harvests everywhere. And it's making food security increasingly unstable. So we still have a window left where we can act, but the window is closing soon, and all depends on how ambitious governments will be when it comes to cutting emissions. And so far, we see this ambition is not there. We have a criminal lack of ambition shown by all governments, but they can make up for it because next year they are supposed to submit new reduction targets under the Paris Agreement, and this will show whether or not the world will be able to control climate change.
Patrick, we seem to be trapped in a vicious cycle that goes something like this. Climate change makes agriculture more difficult, but agriculture itself is also exacerbating climate change. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, and I would add to that we're probably in the last chance saloon in terms of addressing irreversible climate change. But the bad news and the good news is that firstly, the majority of the planet's surface used to be covered with rainforests, and now, of course, it's been replaced by farms. But the good news is that not only are farms part of the problem, but they could become part of the solution if we changed our agricultural practices at scale. And I know that's possible because I've been practicing more sustainable agriculture for the last 40 years here on this 300-acre farm in West Wales.
Simon, how much of an impact has farming had, whether you're talking about methane production from dairy farming or clearing lands for agricultural use?
Overall, it's about 23% of all greenhouse gas emissions are from farming and agriculture. And one big chunk of that is deforestation in the tropics, producing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Another is from animal farming, from ruminants and methane. And then a third big area is nitrous oxide emissions, which are largely from over-application of fertilizer. And these three gases are contributing to climate change in the atmosphere. And as we know, that if we want to stabilize the climate system, then those emissions from both fossil fuels and from agriculture need to decline to zero.
Jan, you spoke a few moments ago about the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, in 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that he was pulling the U.S. out of the climate agreement by the year 2020. And since then, you've seen moves by his administration to repeal regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, where does everything stand when it comes to the Paris Climate Accord since the U.S. announced that it is pulling out?
Well, all other countries are staying in the accord, and they are trying to increase the ambition they have when it comes to climate action at home. So there's support all around except the United States. And that is only the United States administration. So it's the Trump administration. The rest of the country is stepping up on the climate crisis. So you see lots of action and legislation on the federal state level, for instance. Consumers, people, citizens, they all are aware of the growing climate crisis. And we will have to get the US back on board, of course. But that doesn't stop the rest to move ahead. And it is moving ahead, not at the scale and the speed we need, but it is moving ahead. So renewable energies are getting ground everywhere. Coal power is phased out in many, many countries, including my country, Germany, for instance. So the world is moving on, and the US will have to step up.
Patrick, one of the stark conclusions in the IPCC report is that soil is being lost between 10 and 100 times faster than it is being formed in plowed areas. Could you explain more to the viewers what exactly that means and how dire that makes the situation?
Well, certainly soil carbon loss due to industrial and intensive agriculture during my farming lifetime has been one of the very major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. But there is good news there, which is that if we changed our farming practices and went back to rotational farming, mixed farming, which combines a fertility building period normally with grass and forage legumes with an exploitative period which will be producing vegetables or grains or other foods that we can eat, we can actually rebuild the lost soil carbon and possibly take up to 100 parts per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere. But we can only do that and produce enough food for us to eat if we graze the pastures with ruminant animals, that's sheep and cattle. And picking up on Simon's point, we do need to get to zero emissions from agriculture, but that means net zero emissions because we cannot avoid the methane emissions from the grass-fed ruminants, but they can be offset by the soil carbon gain of the soils which we need to rebuild, the ones that have been degraded that you mentioned. So it's a complex issue, but we all need to become experts in understanding the kinds of farming systems that we need to replace the ones that are causing all the damage. And then we need to align our future diets to the productivity of those systems. If we can't do that, then even if farmers want to change, they won't be able to sell their products on the marketplace. And this is a big issue at the moment because a lot of people mistakenly think that going vegan or nearly 100% plant-based will solve the problem, when in fact, we need pasture land to hold the carbon and to rebuild the carbon as part of an integrated system.
Simon, you heard Patrick there talk about the need to change farming practices. Obviously, changing farming practices, that is a massive undertaking, and you would have to incentivize this for farmers. How could that be done in parts of the world where farmers are really suffering and don't have the resources to do that?
Well, there's a big set of policy questions that come out of this IPCC report, and for small farmers, one of the major issues in developing countries is getting that product to market fast and avoiding food waste. So avoiding food waste to get it to people to be able to eat is really important. So there are interventions there that governments can help farmers with to be able to increase their yields and increase what they get from their land, and therefore contribute to producing more food to be able to take pressure off converting more of land into agricultural land.
Jan, the report says that there's a huge opportunity to use land differently, to emit less, to restore ecosystems we've wrecked, and also to store more carbon. But just how difficult would that be to achieve, and how long might it take?
It is a big challenge because it is not only restoring ecosystems that we need to do in order for them to become a net sink of emissions, for instance. We also need to look at how we can support local communities and indigenous peoples to get the land rights for the land they live on and they work on, so that they become stewards of the land in order, which will much more make them able to adapt to a changing climate. And of course, it all depends on the willingness of governments to actually do that. And in some cases, especially in developing countries, it also depends on the support they are getting from the rich countries, who are obliged to provide that support under the Paris Agreement, but they are failing to do this on adequate levels. But if they would step up that and say, okay, we would like to support your food systems to adapt to climate change, and we want to do that in a sustainable way, and we also provide the money that we have promised under the Paris Agreement, we will get a big step further.
Patrick, I saw you nodding along to what Jan was saying. Did you want to jump in?
Yes, I agree with what he says completely. But of course, the key issue is what kind of farming systems that the aid in the rich countries is supporting. Because until now, many of the aid charities, despite their best intentions, have actually supported the kind of farming systems which are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. I'll give you an example. A lot of the aid programs encourage farmers to use more nitrogen fertilizer, and yet the IPCC report, highlights the fact that a third of the greenhouse gas emissions come from nitrous oxide, mostly connected with the use of nitrogen fertilizer, which itself is contributing to the oxidization of previously carbon-rich soils. So we really need to make sure that the future aid from the big aid charities, and indeed from foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and USAID, target the right kind of sustainable practices, which absolutely hasn't been the case in the past. We've tended to be exporting our industrial systems to Africa and other developing countries rather than the systems we need now to address climate change.
Simon, one of the main points in the report is that the way that humans consume food is playing a big role in the climate crisis, and that cutting consumption of some types of food could potentially help start turning things around. But I would imagine that there are few things more politically or socially fraught than trying to dictate to societies what foods they can and cannot eat. So how do you go about start tackling that challenge?
Well, the IPCC report is policy neutral, so it's putting out the evidence. And the evidence is that growing food to feed animals, to feed people, is a very inefficient way of utilizing the land. So if we want more land for nature, and if we want more land to be able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and contribute to the solution to climate change, then we need to free up land. And one of the ways we can free up land is by switching to more plant-based diets. So it's not saying that everyone needs to go vegetarian or vegan, but for those rich people in the world who consume a lot of animal products, to lower those will have knock-on effects of both reducing the emissions from the animals themselves, reducing the emissions from the agriculture, from all the inputs of the plants that are fed to the animals, and will slow down the rate of deforestation, as in the new land that's required to feed this intensive system of producing so many animals. Now, just to get an idea of the scale of animal production and its impact on the natural world, is if you weighed all the land mammals on all of Earth's land surface, if you weighed them all, about 30% of that weight would be the weight of humans. 67% of that weight would be the weight of our livestock animals. and just 3% would be the weight of all the wild animals. So we're really out of balance with the ecosystems and the requirements, including sequestration of carbon, slowing down the rate of climate change. And one of those ways of doing that is to reduce the amount of meat consumption of the people who are the highest consumers of meat in the world, the richest people. But the report is clear that if you want to see that those outcomes of freeing up land to be able to tackle climate change, then that's got to come from somewhere. And one of the most inefficient ways of using land is for meat production rather than producing crops directly for human consumption.
Patrick, I can see you want to jump in. Please go ahead.
Yes, I do. I mean, Simon's absolutely right that there's a lot of inefficient meat production in the world, and we need to cut down on that kind of meat production. That, by the way, is mainly grain-fed, intensive poultry, pork, and intensively managed dairy cows. But we also need to recognise that without ruminants, we can't turn the grass and the cellulose material in grasslands into food that we can eat. And the ruminants grazing those systems will play a vital part in rebuilding the fertility that we've lost. So we need, as citizens and consumers, to be able to differentiate between the kind of livestock systems which are part of the problem, which is the grain-fed intensive white meat systems, and those systems which are absolutely essential and part of the solution and actually quite efficient, because if you've got a grass system, that's the only way you can produce food off it, and the animals actually directly contribute towards holding on to the carbon bank. And if you think about it, we ought to be advised and advise ourselves not only what kind of meat is the right kind of meat to eat, if we eat meat, but also what kind of plants we eat, because palm oil, genetically modified soy, almond milk, oilseed rape, these are all plant foods, but they're produced in ways which are damaging the planet and contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to be able to differentiate between the wrong plants and the right plants, the wrong animals and the right animals.
Jan, these warnings from the IPCC are emerging just about a month after it was revealed from reports in Brazil that every single minute, an area of the Amazon rainforest roughly the size of a football pitch is being cleared. I mean, the Amazon is a vital carbon store, carbon bank that slows down the pace of global warming. So you have this very dire set of warnings and recommendations from the IPCC, and then you have the reality on the ground. I mean, how do you reconcile that? And do you think that there is political willpower at this time in the world to really tackle this in a meaningful way?
Well, there is some, but maybe not always in the right places. So it's up to governments to come to the September Climate Summit in New York on the invitation of the UN Secretary General and come up with increased targets for reducing emissions, because currently we have a criminal inadequate targets all around. So hardly any country is doing enough to confront the climate crisis. So that's, of course, the first start. And of course, you need to look into different country situations, what is causing emissions. And countries like Brazil, but also other forest countries or countries with high forest cover might want to look into options. Can we commit to cut deforestation to zero? What are the options for doing that? And as we already discussed a little bit, moving away from industrial agriculture towards agriculture that is based on agroecological farming practices is, of course, a way to go. Agroforestry systems and so forth, putting the land into the hands of the indigenous peoples and the local communities can do a lot, including in feeding the world, but of course also adapting to climate change and reducing emissions.
Simon, the report also singles out food waste and its contributing factor to climate change. How effectively could this be tackled?
Well, it needs to be tackled at both ends. So the getting the food from the field into the market, to consumers, and then at the other end, when consumers buy it, to make sure that it's not wasted before people eat that food. So there are different sets of policies for those two different ends of the food waste spectrum. And then, of course, supermarkets in the middle are also wasting considerable amounts of food.
Jan, food insecurity is a big factor in international migration. If food shortages worsen, and if they affect poorer parts of the world more than richer ones, what could that mean when it comes to migration patterns going forward?
Well, we need to understand that people do not want to move away from home, so they usually want to stay home, but sometimes the situation worsens to a state where they actually cannot stay, where their livelihoods are destroyed or damages or unsustainable, and then they have to move. And what we see is, of course, that people try to stay in their cultural context in their country, so they would move within the boundaries of their country or maybe cross-border to neighboring countries. That is, of course, a situation that can create additional conflicts, and that makes it even more important that we assist those countries, we meaning the rich world, we assist those countries in adapting to climate change, in making livelihoods possible in a changing climate, so that people do not have to move, because, as I said, they don't want to if they don't have to, and they wouldn't move unless they are forced to do so by these external factors, such as climate change, to which, by the way, they have not contributed anything. So it's all the richer world, or perhaps the richer sections of emerging economies, populations, but it's basically the wealthy people that are causing the problem, the poor people suffering from it. And if these people are given the chance to adapt to a changing climate, they would be more than happy to sustain their livelihoods where they are, and we wouldn't have that sort of crisis.
Patrick, implementing these recommendations would also require a shift in consumer behavior as well, would it not?
Yes, it would. And one of the problems, which is a great barrier to that shift in consumer behavior, which is necessary, is dishonest food pricing. At the moment, if you're a farmer, farming intensively, using lots of chemical fertilizers and pesticides and growing monocultures pays better than if you're farming sustainably. And that's because the damage caused to the environment, to natural capital, to greenhouse gas emissions, and of course to public health, is not charged to the farmers and the food producers who cause it. And that's no fault of their own. It's just that we don't enforce the polluter pays principle. So we really do need to make sure that, to use economist language, we pay for our negative externalities. And that way, the business case for farming sustainably will improve, and the affordability of sustainably produced food will be greater. And that both those factors will encourage the shift that is necessary. But there is another thing, which is that there's a huge amount of confusion out there amongst the public in relation to the question, what should I eat to be healthy and sustainable? A lot of people think, in my view, erroneously, that they simply switch to a plant-based diet, they've solved the problem. But as I've tried to explain during this program, they actually need to eat the ruminant animal products from the fertility building aspects of the farming systems, and feel that by doing so they're part of the solution, whereas they need to give up altogether eating the industrially produced, factory farmed poultry and pigs and dairy products, which are absolutely part of the problem, and they need to know the difference between the two. So we need an education revolution which supports doing the right thing, and that needs to be aligned with the sustainable farming practices which replace the ones we've got at the moment.
Simon, we only have about 30 seconds left. How rapidly is the window to all this closing?
Every ton of emissions going into the atmosphere matters, because it's the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that counts in terms of the climate change that we'll see. So every bit of reduction counts, but the window is closing to reduce some of the really serious impacts that are coming in the future if we don't get emissions from fossil fuels and from agriculture right down very fast.
All right, we have run out of time for now. Thanks to all our guests, Simon Lewis, Patrick Holden, and Jan Kowalzig. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohamed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.